Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Just as a reminder, this webinar will be in English. Tonight, we will talk about strategic design and project delivery. My name is Gabriele Filieri, and I'm a volunteer of the PMI Northern Italy chapter. I'm part of the development team, which is the team supporting professional development through a number of initiatives, such as the organization of international webinars. I would like to welcome Lee Lambert. We are honored to have him tonight as our speaker. But before starting with the webinar, let me give you some useful information. First of all, attending this webinar gives you the opportunity to get one PDU for all PMI certifications. The PDU relates to the strategic PMI talent triangle skill area. Then, if you have questions, I kindly ask you to use the proper questions chat window. You can send them in any time during the webinar. If you want, you can ask the question in Italian, and then I will try to translate it as best as I can. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And finally, you will receive an email just after the webinar to complete the survey and express your opinion about the webinar. It will take you only 5 minutes to do it. There are only 10 questions. Okay, now I'm going to introduce briefly the webinar topic. This webinar examines the critical relationship between organizational strategy and the execution of projects. In particular, it describes the potential value of maintaining strategy-project connection and the way to achieve and maintain that vital connection. Just few words about Lee. He worked in the private sector, performing senior management positions. In 1981, he was invited to be an integral part of the creation of the PMI PMP certification. He also received one of the PMI's highest honor for his learning programs, which is the Professional Development Provider of the Year in 2007. He is author of 2 books. He lectured more than 50,000 students in 23 countries. Okay, now Lee, I'll hand it over to you for your presentation. So when you're ready, you can start. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. One thing that your audience should know, because that either makes them like me or not like me, is that because of my role in the development of the PMP process, I'm also the one that created the need for PDUs. So I created a little cottage industry, and that's what I've been doing since 1984, is providing PDU training to those people who are in need of those to maintain that PMP. Now, we've got about 1.2 million people with the PMP, so there's plenty of requirements for PDUs. I was also named as one of only 70 PMI fellows out of a membership of about 700,000 worldwide. And of those 70, actually 15 of them are dead, passed away. So there's really only about 55 of us right now living and breathing. So I love what I do. I enjoy having the opportunity to make a difference for people throughout the world. Now, I stumbled upon this particular opportunity because of the pandemic. I found myself limited to what I could do. I was required to stay in, and I couldn't go out and meet people and interface with people. So I decided to offer to deliver this 1 hour webinar on strategic design and project delivery to anyone in the PMI environment who wanted to take advantage of it free. There's no cost involved. And so I put out a call letter to 301 PMI chapters, and I got about 55, as a matter of fact, who responded. And I've literally been all over the world in providing this program, and so far I've covered 52 chapters and about 10,000 people. So You all are the 53rd presentation I've made. We tried to make this a couple of months ago, but we had some technology problems, and I'm sure some of you may remember that. So I'm really excited that we were able to reschedule. Here's where I'm coming from. When Sunil Prashara stepped in as the new CEO and president of the PMI, he introduced at the Global Congress in Philadelphia a concept that's always been real near and dear to my heart, and one that I really thought about long before Sunil stepped in, but he's really brought us to the forefront of project management, and he called it the project economy. Now, he rolled this out in Philadelphia, very well presented, and I see him now on LinkedIn all the time talking about it. And here's why it hit a chord with me. Now, I've been in this business since 1966, so that's probably before some of you were even born. I've been doing this, so I've been doing it a long time, and I've always felt like everything is a project, and therefore everyone is a project manager. That's just always the way I've felt. I don't think there's anything magical about project management. I think we all do it in one form or another. Some of us get paid to do it. Some of us just do it because it's the right thing to do. But that's how I settled in on this topic. So what I'm going to try to do is walk you through some of the key components. Now, I'm going to put a little more emphasis on the role of the project manager as opposed to the role of the senior level executives. I'll link those together, but I want to make sure you all get the importance of this idea of strategic linkage in developing and executing projects in an organization. So let me just kind of point out to you. Our organizations don't just we don't just do projects for the heck of it. I mean, we don't sit around and say, well, let's do a project on that. We do projects to contribute to what we've anticipated will be required to make our organization successful. So annually, at least annually, sometimes it's a little more often, sometimes a little less, but annually, all of the senior level decision makers, I just call them the C level, CIO, CEO, COO, CFO, all the C level people, they get themselves together and they spend time trying to determine what their objectives, what are their strategic objectives for the coming year that will enable them to achieve their desired results with the organization. So they create some business objectives, some strategic objectives like increased sales, decreased cost, increased market share, whatever those objectives might be. Those become the strategic objectives. They're at the high level, at the C level, and they've decided those are the things we need to do to accomplish success in our organizations. Well, here's what you need to understand. When we get the strategic objectives defined, when we've created this so-called strategic design, what we need to realize is that each one of those strategic objectives will spawn 2 or 3 or 5 independent projects that will work towards the achievement of that strategic objective. Now we've begun to use the concept of portfolio. So we take those 4 or 5 projects that have been spawned by some strategic objective, and we lump them into a portfolio where we are all moving in a similar direction. In other words, they're related to one another, and so that becomes the value add for the projects that will support that strategic objective. So that's kind of where it's come from. I think my view is when I go into organizations and ask a lot of questions, and I ask, they're easy questions to me, but they seem to think they're hard. But you know, why are you doing this project? And sometimes the answers I get are very interesting. So I'm going to spend a little time as we move through the product talking about those things. But I want to point out some of the changing environments. Now, my slides are not advancing. Can you advance that slide? I don't really understand. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, Lee, I don't see advancing them. Yeah.
let me go out and back in and see if I can solve that problem. Not quite sure why that occurred. So let's see now if that will do it. Hold on a second here.
We can see now that, the other slide. If you want to try again the presentation mode.
Yeah, let me try this again. Hold on a second. Oh wow.
But Lee, we can also watch the slides, not in the presentation mode. We can also look at them, in a normal show.
Yeah, if you can do that, I don't know.
Well,
We
why
don't seem
don't
to
you
have
go back to the
technology.
presentation? Why don't you go back to the presentation? Just
Okay, there you go.
okay. Yeah, you can. I mean, I can see that. You can leave it as it is. I'm seeing something different here. Um,
Okay, you can see those slides on the left-hand side.
yeah, we can see them. So
Yeah, let's just do that.
you can.
I can
Okay.
refer to them. That's fine. That the slide that you see now, number 5 on my page, is the rocket ship. What I want to point out here, and this makes a difference, is as we're starting to think about strategic implementation, if we're starting to think about how we're going to move forward on that implementation, we need to be sure we understand what's the methodology we're using. Now, traditionally, we've used the predictive model most of the time. But back again, when I'm in 66, when I start, everything is predictive. We get a project, we define what the objectives were, we get a resources assigned to us permanently. We kept them throughout the life of the project and got the project done. So that was the basic way. Well, as the world has changed over time, and we begin to see that we have introduced a new methodology now called Agile. Then we also have to understand that if I'm working on IT projects, I've got to be comfortable with the agile methodology of implementation because it changes the way we do things. And from a strategic linkage standpoint, we have to be aware of that now the scope of work is not going to be wholly defined at the beginning. It's going to be defined on an elaborative basis as we move through the process. So we're constantly looking at how are we maintaining strategic linkage. So whether you're using IT agile, hybrid, waterfall, predictive. You just need to understand that and what the impact might be on the work that you're going to do. Now, the key here is understanding strategy. I don't think a lot of project managers get it when it comes to strategy. I actually think that they believe that their world is getting the project done, and they never really consider seriously what the strategy is. But if you remember on the PMBOK, we've got this thing called a project charter. I'm sure you remember that. Well, when we get that project charter, one of the things that we should be finding out in the beginning is that we need to understand what the strategic objective that project supports. I want to see that on the project charter. And I'll explain why this is important a little bit later on, but this is critical because if I don't know what the strategic support is, if I don't know what strategic objective I'm aligned with, then that impacts my ability to have any influence over the way I execute the project. So that's one area. Another area that I'll talk about as we move forward is prioritization. So knowing the strategy gives you an insight into the prioritization. So project people need to broaden their thinking to understand the importance of recognizing and incorporating the process of strategy into the plan for execution of their project. So it's important that we do that. Now, if you don't do that, if you choose to just ignore that and stick your head in the sand and just do whatever the heck you've been doing for a gazillion years, you may deliver the project scope, time, cost, the most traditional of project management techniques. You may deliver the project, but along the way, you may have become disconnected from the strategic objective that the project was created for in the first place. So you have a responsibility not to bury your hand in the sand, not to disregard strategic linkage, but instead articulate it, identify it, communicate it, so that we are constantly looking at cause and effect relationships of, if this happens on the project, this is the impact it's going to have on our ability to achieve a strategic objective. That becomes critical. And so we really got to focus on that much more than we have in the past. Now, I've been in the business since I worked like you all are doing since until 1984, when I went out and started to do what I'm doing now, and had a chance to connect with over 50,000 people in 23 countries. And so I've gotten a good sense of what's working and what isn't working. And this is one of the areas that I'm very uncomfortable about, is not maintaining the linkage. So when I come in and ask you, what strategic objectives does your project support, you don't glass over and look like, huh? You know what project it supports, and it gives you a tremendous amount of leverage, if you will, in being able to influence outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into this process. So I also then, as I mentioned, priority becomes important. One of the things, unless your organization is much different than most of the ones that I work with today, you are working in a matrix environment where you have resource pools that are made available to support projects that are therefore supporting strategic objectives. So knowing what priority your project is vital when it comes to getting the resources you need. So if let's just use an engineering pool if I can. Let's say I've got 15 or 20 engineers in the resource pool, and projects need engineers, and so the resource pool owner begins to allocate those resources to various projects until we run out of resources. Now we got 2 projects that haven't gotten any resources yet, so that means they're certainly not going to get done. And then we've got some resources that are misappropriated, skill sets are too high for the work that's being done, and all of a sudden we've got a confused situation where our resource pool is not being homogenized to support all of the projects that it can possibly support. So in order to do that, you need to know what the priority of your project is. If you've got 25 projects and yours is number 2 on the hit parade, it's the second most important project in the organization, I'm going to just guess here that you're going to get the resources you need. They're going to make sure you get the resource you need. But if your project's number 22 on a list of 25, you're going to find yourself begging, borrowing, stealing, maybe doing outsourced, bring in an outside resource to get resources to execute your project because it's lower on the priority structure. I spent a lot of time working with General Electric. I was with them for 11 years. I spent another important amount of time with IBM in formulating this idea of strategic linkage. GE was not too good at it when we started. They ordered them and based on how each of the C-level people felt about their particular area, but not what was best for the organization. On the IBM example, Lou Gerstner came in to turn IBM around in 1993. He evaluated all the projects going on in the organization at the time. They were projecting an $8 billion loss. He evaluated all of the projects that were going on, and when he was all done, he made an announcement that he was eliminating 60% of the projects that were being done at IBM. They had lost focus. They had lost information in terms of what added value and what didn't. So he made a call that said 60% gone. And now we're going to focus our attention on the truly high priority elements. And one of those included, and you may be aware of this, but back in those days, the IBM ThinkPad, that was the laptop, that was the desktop, that was the number one tool that was being used in those days. Well, he decided that wasn't in the future for IBM, and he sold that laptop, that ThinkPad, to China, as a matter of fact, and now it's known as Lenovo. So some of you may have a Lenovo. You really have an IBM ThinkPad repositioned into the Chinese marketplace. So we know how to do that, but if you don't know what the priorities are, then you don't really have a comprehensive way of determining what's important from what's not important. And if that impacts your resource allocation problems, then you've got to make sure that you can overcome those. So what we're trying to do with the integration of all this project information is create an integrated data set so that we can now look at it from a strategic standpoint and understand that if this happens on project B, that has this impact on strategic objective A. So we want to be able to make those connections, not guesswork. We want to make a strategic connection utilizing the strategy of how that organizational element integrates all of the projects. So in order to do that, of course, you have to have the work breakdown structure, which we're all familiar with that concept. That gives me the vertical hierarchy, the decomposition down to the working level, where I can assign people, I can assign costs, I can assign risks. I mean, I call it the foundation of all things project management. And so we get that vertical, but now the difference is in the matrix environment, we now also have to integrate the horizontal data. So when we got a resource pool with 20 engineers, we need to be able to know where those engineers are assigned, what their productivity ranking is, when they're going to be available and when they're not. And all of that is then integrated horizontally into the vertical hierarchy so that we now have an integrated data set. So now what's happened is we actually self-integrate our projects into the structure of the strategic objectives. Now this, you're not going to do this by hand. You know, back when I started with GE back in '66, I mean, really, I had a paper and pencil and an abacus practically. Well, no more. I mean, now we've got automated capability that just makes me wonder why we're not doing this more effectively. So we need to really look at what's it take to create the framework that allows us to do that effectively. So in order to do that, one of the things we have to look at carefully is the stakeholder composition. Now remember, if you've been around the PMI world for very long, in the 5th edition, we added the new section called stakeholder management. And that was a recognition that we understand how critical this concept of stakeholders and how we set them up and how we communicate with them and how we capitalize on them really has become in the project world. So if we've got that importance identified, and since we added a whole chapter, it must be pretty important, then we need to recognize how this all comes together. So let me give you a little overview. In the stakeholder concept, there's a stakeholder grouping above what you see in this graphic, and that grouping, those are the controlled stakeholders. These are, I'll call them the big shots, the decision makers, the strategic level, the C level, if you will. And we need to identify relative to our project who are the control stakeholders that can impact my project. And by impact, I mean control implies just what it means to imply. They can turn your project on or turn your project off. They have control. Generally speaking, at least one or two of these will be signatory on the project charter, but there may be others, legal, of quality. There may be others that have the ability to stop or start your project, and they may not be identified on the project charter. So those are very important people. Now remember, we're going to be communicating with them at high levels. They don't want a bunch of inordinate detail. They don't want the nits and grits, and they want the big picture. That's our job, is to stay connected with the strategy by providing the big picture, okay? Second level is what you see here, and these are I've given them a name called impact or influence stakeholders. These are all the people that are going to be working on your project in any way whatsoever. In other words, any output that they provide will have an impact on or have an effect on your project. So they are impact stakeholders. So they're going to be influence or impact stakeholders, okay? But they're not all. That's not all, because in the matrix we also have to understand that some of the resource pool type people, let's go back to my engineering example, the manager of the engineering pool is a stakeholder in your project, because your project and how it goes about being executed impacts how he or she can allocate their resources. So, and that may be true with several different resource pools. So they're also influence or impact stakeholders, but they're not actually doing work. They're providing resources that do work. Again, linking it to the strategic objectives. So as soon as the engineer says, sorry, I can't get you the subject matter expert, I can then translate that to an impact on the project and therefore communicate that back to the strategic level that may require someone else get involved to get me the resource, okay? So those are two levels. The third level is one I want to talk about. That a lot of people disagree with me on this, but I'm going to explain this in context of financials. I'm going to explain what an $11 billion stakeholder looks like, okay? In about 1988-89 timeframe, I was hired to run a project that needed to be, in fact, it was called a miracle project. It was a 3-year project they needed done in 18 months. So they hired me to run that project and then gave me anything I wanted, essentially, to make it happen, okay? And so I started putting together my team from the functional organization, getting all the best people and the brightest people. And one of the areas that I needed people was chemistry. Now, this is a blood glucose monitoring in-home use product for diabetics. So it's a chemistry product. So I needed chemists. I got 25 top chemists. Now, that left 75 functional chemists not committed to the project. This caused a big problem. Organizationally, there were a lot of very upset people. It started to impact our productivity. And so I said, okay, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take my 25 chemists and we're going to get them together with the 75 functional chemists every Friday for 4 weeks. And we're not going to have any agenda, any specific objectives. We're just going to get together and talk about what we're doing, what's working, what isn't working, what your suggestions will be, but just exchange information, okay? So they thought, oh, that's fine, they do that. So they did that for 4 weeks, and then it was time to get on with the project. So we did that. We got on with the project. We got the project done in 18 months. It was written up in magazines as a miracle project. PMI wrote it up. And so it was a winner, okay? Now, I never really mentioned to anybody at the time, but the chemistry that eventually went to market was actually developed by the functional chemists. In other words, my project chemists were not able to solve the problem. And so because we had the fallback of the functional chemists, we were able to deliver that project. That project, this is a $1 billion company owned by the Engelhorn family in Mannheim, Germany. That product went to the marketplace, $1 billion company at the time, and just began to grab massive amounts of market share. I mean, it was amazing to see how much market share we could grab in 1 year. Well, in 3 years from the time we went live, Roche Laboratories, which I'm sure you've heard of, Roche Laboratories purchased this little German-owned company for $11 billion. $11 billion. So that information stakeholder, remember, they don't have a contributing role. They just want information. They just want to kind of know what's going on. That information stakeholder was valued at $11 billion. So my view is this: I want to include information stakeholders because it may pay big dividends, but if it doesn't pay a dividend for you on your project, there's a good probability it'll pay a dividend for someone else on another project. Because what it basically is with an information stakeholder, for communicating with them, it's a live closeout review. That's basically what it amounts to. So $11 billion difference. I get a Christmas card from the Engelhorn family every single year. That's it. I don't get anything else, but they recognize the importance of it. That product is still #1 in terms of revenue generation, in terms of profit margin for Roche Laboratories. So it's been a big success, primarily due to the information stakeholder. Now, we also have to recognize that one of the problems that I've had with project management is that our obsession with tools, the absolute obsession with the amount of tools that we have. Every year there's new tools, make it faster, better, cheaper, new tools, automated tools. The fact of the matter is, we got too darn many tools. That's my view. I mean, that's just 54 years of experience. What can I say? That's my view. So I'm going to tell you the 3 tools that you can't do without. I'm not going to tell you you can't use any of the other tools. I'm just going to say the 3 that you can't do without. And the first one I've covered fairly extensively, the work breakdown structure. And as I've called it, it's the foundation of all things project management. All things project management are grounded in the project work breakdown structure. Okay. Second tool that you must have, and this is the one I find missing more often than not, is a critical path schedule. How can you determine strategic impacts when you can't even define project impacts based on the status of individual work packages within your plan? So you need to have a critical path schedule that shows dependent relationships, that times it so that we can identify a critical path and float paths. This is one of the most critical components to identifying strategic impacts, because I can begin to predict strategic impacts long before they actually occur. And that's what project managers should be. We should be proactive investigators of challenges. What are the things that we should be examining and preventing having an impact in the future? Okay, so critical path schedule. Third thing, which is I think it's gotten more recognition than it previously has had, but risk management, the whole risk management process. Because if we're going to have a critical path that identifies what the impact of time slippage is, or other risk events occurring, then we need to be able to identify carefully and thoroughly the risk events, what kind of risks they are, the frequency of their occurrence, the impact should they occur, the mitigation strategy, all the things that you and I as PMPs know about risk management. So those are the 3 concepts, the 3 tools that you must satisfy. Now, you see a lot of the others in here, the leadership, the earned value, and Gantt charts and cost plans, and those are all, I mean, whatever. They may have a role, and you decide that. But you'll notice in my tool chest, frankly, the most important tool that I've ever come across is I haven't even found room in the toolbox, and that's called common sense. I wrote a book years ago now, back in the 80s actually, called Project Management, The Common Sense Approach. A best-selling book, over 50,000 copies in circulation. Project management ain't brain surgery. And if we've got the kind of concepts available to us, tools available to us, then the key is, how do I apply the common sense that lets me capitalize on those tools? So just having the tools, I know some people that I work with all the time that have more dang tools than you can shake a stick at. And that's something that you have to recognize, is that just having a tool doesn't mean it's going to provide you the kind of information, decision support information that you need. So you've got to tailor the tool to the direct application. Now, as I said, we had a predictive model, and then we had the agile Scrum model, the hybrid model, but we also have the waterfall model. Now, as we moved away from completely predictive, we began to evolve into what's called the waterfall method. And it's very similar to predictive. It's similar to the work breakdown structure approach to doing a project with a little more flexibility built in. But what we found was the problem that really drove us to Agile is the fact that when we start an IT project, we oftentimes don't really know what the requirements are. In fact, part of the project is the evolution of the actual requirements. And so the waterfall didn't work as well, because if we don't have requirements, we don't have requirements. So now we get to the agile approach, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But from a waterfall perspective, there are still organizations that use the waterfall approach. I'm not demeaning it by any stretch, but what we find is less and less of these people because we've really morphed into the agile approach, and we've reconstructed the entire capability stream, the position descriptions, and so on. But for waterfall, I do a lot of training for the LDS Church out of Salt Lake City. And they've made a big transition to Agile, Scrum, Hybrid, but they still have a waterfall group. Now, when I go there to the temple grounds and I go upstairs to the IT department, I'll notice this little group of people over here to the left-hand side as I go up the stairs. And I know right away they're Agile. They're the waterfall group. And the reason I know is the waterfall group tends to be old, chronologically old, because they've grown up with it. They don't want to make the change to Agile, so they just keep grinding it away. So we'll probably have some waterfall forever. I mean, if we do a hybrid where it's 80% software and 20% hardware and other non-agile approaches, then the waterfall has a place that we need to capitalize on. So the waterfall is a passing fancy, if you will. What we really have now is this approach. Now, I use this approach because I want to make sure I communicate what's going on here. As you can see, this circle of people gathered around the PM with the requirements on the ground is sort of the way Agile works. Because you see, what happened is Agile took the game of rugby from England and converted the game of rugby into a software management approach. So if you look at this and you say, well, but we got all these people in a big circle, and then we throw the requirements in the middle. This is called a scrum, where we got all these people fighting their way, get the ball. I want to get the requirements. They're fighting, they're pushing, they're shoving, they're biting, they're scratching. And finally, the ball shoots out the other side. Somebody runs and grabs it and runs as far as they can before it's time for another scrum. That's agile in a nutshell. Okay, so we still have a PM role, but it's dramatically changed. The agile approach to project management has dramatically changed the role of the PM. So now all of these certified PMP people we have in the profession, now they're starting to wonder, is my PMP still going to be valid? In fact, I would tell you, I get probably 8 or 10 calls a week asking me a very simple question: should I forget about this PMP and go get my Scrum certification, or what do you think? And my answer is basically, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. You already got the PMP, so go ahead and get the Scrum certificate. And so then as the future unfolds, you're prepared to go either way. But it has changed dramatically, the role of the PM, because now the Scrum Master is the big player. The Scrum Master is the driver of the process. So we have to be willing to recognize still plenty of work for the PM to do. Don't get me wrong, but they're not the same. The role is not the same as it once was. Okay. All right. So next slide is an important one as I get closer to the end of my presentation here, and that is this. If you are the delivery mechanism, you're the server, if you will, of this particular this enchilada, and we're going to serve our senior level executives, our CI levels, our CIO, CFO, all the C levels. I've got a job to do here. Believe it or not, if you convince yourself, or I convince you, or someone convinces you of the power of this approach to integrating with the strategy based on the composition of the projects. If I buy into that, then I got to sell it to management. Because management, back when we first started with enterprise project management, all the senior level people, yes, that's what we need. We need higher levels of visibility in how this all fits together. And then they started to use it, and then they recognized it's also uncovered a lot of the areas where they were not fulfilling their own responsibilities to ensure that the management is done effectively. So you still got to convince them that there's something in it for them, not only for them personally, but financially. Because remember, in order to do this, you have to have an automated approach. Okay, you have to have. Back in IBM, they formed the IBM Center of Excellence, Project Management Center of Excellence, and they wrote their own software. They integrated their own projects. Well, we can't afford to do that these days, especially when there's not off the shelf literally, but things that you can purchase and modify and satisfy the needs of your organization without a horrendous investment of finances. But if you want to do this, if you want to connect your strategy, identify your prioritization, then you're going to have some sort of a software package that integrates all this information. Now, I've been working with the firm out of Dublin, Ireland. I don't have any ownership or any vested interest in it, but I've stumbled across them in my recent years of exploration. And the company's called Cora Systems. They're based out of Dublin, Ireland, and they've got a great little PPM, project portfolio management capability. I've had 5 or 6 demos now. I'm convinced it could do anything I wanted it to do if I were a project manager again. And so, but there's probably dozens of those. That just happens to be one I could vouch for directly. But I bet you there's lots more just like them. So we've got to make sure that we recognize that management needs to be prepared to recognize that there's an investment here. I can't talk about all the benefits without understanding that it's going to take an investment by the organization to enable us to realize all those benefits. Okay. All right, let me do this last slide and then I'll open it up to questions. There probably will be a few. This slide is it's really on purpose in that I know this guy. In fact, I know two guys that have fallen into this same situation. And I wanted to tell you about them because it's important for you to know what's out there, what you need to be aware of. So these guys are really good at triple constraint, scope, time, cost, hammering it out, scope, time, cost, every project, scope, time, cost, on time, on budget, get her done. Okay. Well, I sort of warned them of this changing environment where strategy has taken on a whole new meaning. And they said, yeah, whatever, scope, time, cost, scope, time, cost. Well, eventually they delivered a project that scope, time, cost. Management called them in and said, hey, listen, awesome job. You got this thing done on time, on budget, and so on. But there's an important thing you missed. You disconnected from the strategy. So the project you've delivered doesn't have the strategic impact that we had hoped it would have. So in the future, you need to be sure that in addition to scope, time, cost, you're staying connected strategically to what the organization's attempting to accomplish. And so they, yeah, whatever. And so they went about their business, and I'll be damned if they didn't do the same thing. Well, this time the outcome wasn't quite so interesting. Both guys were fired. I mean, they just didn't get it. They didn't understand the C-level. They were looking for project people who knew how to connect to what was good for the organization, not just good for project A or B or C. And so they went about their merry way, and I'm sure they're delivering scope, time, cost in some other location at this point. But I just want to make sure that you understand this is not a new area. It's new that we should be paying more attention to it, but the strategies always existed. The projects have always existed, but we've never really done a good job of tying them together. That's the new responsibility that the successful project manager needs to take on. Okay, that wraps up my formal presentation, and I'd be happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Okay, Lee, thanks for your amazing presentation. You know, we really appreciate your experience and the passion you have for project management. A couple of questions, you know. The first question is, I was wondering if you have ever experienced sometimes when the project strategic importance changes, you know, along the way, along the project life, you know. So at the beginning, the project might be high priority, really important, and then it becomes low priority. Have you ever experienced something like that? What did you do? You know, what the project manager should do in that case?
Yeah,
You know?
I have experienced that on several occasions. In the program I did yesterday, this same question came up, and you know, I sensed that there were project managers feeling sorry for themselves. But wait, I had this all lined up, and now management went and changed it. Yeah, get over it. That's the way it works. The problem you have to understand is we've got to have some confidence that the senior level people are creating a strategy and or modifying a strategy that's in the best interest of the success of the organization. So we hate it. I mean, I've hated it when this has happened, but the fact of the matter is you just have to pull up your big boy pants and fall behind the new strategic objective direction that we have to take. So there's really no easy way to handle it, and it's certainly not going to do you any good to argue the point because the strategy's been realigned, and therefore I need to make my adjustments accordingly.
Okay, thank you so much. So another question is, about agile. If I understand correctly, you are not a big fan of agile, but I might be wrong. But my observation is that even though agile is becoming more and more used, by organization, my guess is that companies still see value in PMP certification because they always require it, as a requirement for the resource who has to take over a new project. Uh, so, so what's your opinion about having agile more utilized, but the PMP certification is also still a requirement for companies. So maybe there is a
Yeah,
value in that.
here here's my view. You misinterpreted just a little bit. I don't have. Let me point this. I don't have anything against Agile. I don't understand it very well because that's not my area of expertise. But I will say that the Agile approach in the real world of software development, I don't know how we ever did it in the more traditional predictive model. So I think from that standpoint, the application of the Agile approach to software development makes all the sense in the world. If I were a little boy again, I'd probably want to learn Agile really well and start doing software development now. But with that said, there's always going to be projects that don't lend themselves to Agile. I just had a discussion with a guy who feels like, and he tried to create an evidence for me that I didn't buy. He tried to create the fact that he could build buildings with an Agile approach to project management. Well, I don't believe that. I think there will always be projects that will require the discipline that we've become accustomed to with PMP. So that's why I tell people, call me, yeah, which one do you get? Yeah, you get them both. You get your PMP and you get your Agile Scrum certification, because that way you're prepared to go either way. So I think we have to be smart enough to know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And I think the agilist zealots can make an error on that side, as well as the predictive zealots can. So I think we have to be smart enough to make the choice.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question. Let's try to read it. So, what do you suggest? What do you suggest for the organization, to do in order to push the organization to invest more in building a strategic link with PMO? So, what's your suggestion in order for the organization to build this link between strategy and PMO? So what do they do? What do they need to do to invest more? Uh, what's your suggestion on this?
Well, I think what I see happening, and I probably would do the same thing, what I see happening is the formation of a strategic PMO that focuses on the linkage between organizational strategy and what's required to execute the projects to support that strategy. I think the problem we've had with PMOs up till date is that oftentimes PMOs are just busy work. They create a lot of templates, they create a lot of inertia, but they don't necessarily add any value. So I think we have to be able to say the perfect one was IBM's. I mean, this was back in 1993, but the perfect one was the idea that they had a strategic linkage to everything that IBM did. So any project at any time, I could tell you what the strategic linkage was. That's what we need to shoot for. Organizations are reluctant to invest the kind of money because this usually takes very senior level people, very well educated people to establish and maintain a strategic PMO.
Okay, okay, thank you. We have another question that says, can we say that in order to maintain the project aligned to strategy, the PM must also be a business analyst in order to point the value of the product to the project? So in other words, can we say that the business case is always more and more important for the project manager? I mean, so the business case is becoming more important maybe than the project charter, or maybe these things should be built into the same document. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the business case has taken on a new level of importance because we're finding ourselves getting in trouble on the project level because we haven't analyzed and anticipated business implications. I just was in a meeting yesterday with a guy out of Zurich talking about project business foundation, and what we're saying is we need to do a better job of incorporating the business aspects of a project. Whether that's in the charter, it's probably not. That's probably not the right place. But we've got to make sure that we get the business impacts, revenue streams, contracting approaches, all of those kinds of things that traditionally project managers don't really get heavily involved in. But we need to focus on that. Now, I've told people for the past 6 or 8 years that if you're not really crazy about project management per se, then you probably ought to get into the business analysis, because I think there's a lot of fun stuff that goes on for the business analysts, and I think they oftentimes hold the key to the potential for success.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for our last question. So actually, there are two questions. The first one is, will PMP certification end? What's your opinion in that?
I continue to support it. I stay as current with it as I can. There were 5 of us originally that formulated. 2 are dead, 2 are retired. I'm last man standing. I still think it's probably, from a consummate certification standpoint, it still has the highest level of potential value add of any of the ones going on right now.
Okay. And the last one is, I think you have already told about this, how to map corporate strategy with the project requirements and scope.
Well, I think that's a lot easier than we make it out to be, because if I define the C-level strategy, the big objectives we want to accomplish in the coming year, and that spawns 5 projects, by definition, I've already made the linkage between the strategic objectives and those projects. So at that point, then it becomes the project manager's responsibility to define the execution approach to be used, and then be able to link it back to the impacts on strategy.
Okay. Okay, I think we don't have much time left. So I really, again, I really thank you for your time, for giving us this presentation, and the amount of tips, for our job. They are really important for our job. So let me take just a few moments to remind the audience that you will get the email after the webinar, so that you can evaluate the event. You can suggest also other topics for the future. And so again, Lee, thank you very much for your time, and thank you everybody for being here tonight. So I think we can close the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Sure. Bye bye.